Hi, everyone. Welcome to our LGBT History Month panel today for the London Borough of Newham. Our panel today is called Queer Migration and Intersectional Activism. My name is Councillor Rohit K. Dasgupta. I am the Commissioner for Social Integration and Equalities for the Borough. And this has been a fantastic LGBT History Month for us. We have had a number of really good events. Some of you have already been attending those, about films, curation, about art, about youth. And we've also got, if you don't remember, we've got a cabaret at the end of the month to go out with a bang. So again, you can check out all of these details on our website in newhamlgbthistory.org. So it gives me great pleasure to start this panel discussion today, which is on queer migration and intersectional activism. It's particularly quite important for LGBT History Month, but given the very nature of the ways in which we talk about LGBT history, which is of course a very white history, which erases people of color, and especially in a place like Newham, which is one of the most diverse boroughs in the country. 70% of our residents are BAME. And it was very important for us to actually talk about intersectional issues, to talk about migration issues. Another thing I would kind of point out as something that the borough has done, it was 2 years ago when we restarted celebrating in a big way LGBT History Month. We also became the first borough in the country to fly the progress flag, which was to show our solidarity with our trans communities and also with our Black and Brown communities over here in Newham and elsewhere. So I just wanted to kind of say that in those respects, we are trying our best over here, and we would love to welcome you to some of the other events that we're going to be doing over the course of this month. So I want to start off this panel by introducing our first speaker, which is Dr. Chunjit Maan. Dr. Chunjit Maan is a reader in English at the University of Strathclyde and also a fellow of the Young Academy of Scotland. Chunjit's work focuses on the intersection of race and sexuality in the history and practice of travel. She has worked on community-based research projects in South Asia and the UK, including with queer refugees, displaced migrants, and queer and South Asian diasporas. And Chunjit and I are currently working on a project called Cross-Border Queers, the story of South Asian migrants in the UK. So over to you, Chunjit. I will let you know when your time's up.
Much, Rohit. Thank you so much for organising this and the invitation. As you point out, it's such an important topic and one that keeps being missed or is underrepresented in LGBT History Month. I just want to talk about a few things around forms of intersectional activism rather than citing some of the examples, because I think there are other people in the panel today who can give you some amazing examples from a past and a present. So here are my musings about what has gone right and wrong about some intersectional queer activism in the UK. In the past year, we've seen a necessary explosion in online organising to support queer people of colour through the pandemic. Numerous events have been run to foster conversations about speaking or not speaking your mother tongue, finding a language for queer experience outside of English, as well as networks of people simply sharing the challenges of finding their mobility that comes with queer life or living between different camps going wrong. What struck me in the past year is how little some of our stories about coming out have changed, and in some ways how different they are. I came out, and this is now making me feel like a historical artifact, 26 years ago, before the internet. I somehow found my way, I think, through the Glasgow Lesbian and Gay Switchboard to the Glasgow Women's Library, a hotbed of radical feminist activism, and you may have guessed it, lesbianism. It was an incredibly white space. I remember the thrill of picking up a DIY newsletter, a poor photocopy of clunky typewritten script. But in that smudged ink and misplaced letters, I saw words that make me feel recognition and made me feel a physical thrill that I can still remember, words like lesbian and gay. The strange thing is that where the library was housed was a former factory space. My mum had actually been a seamstress in that building. And now here I was, her daughter, wanting to participate in a very different kind of labour, queer and feminist activism. After many years in London, I moved back to Glasgow, and every time I went to talks about the Glasgow Women's Library and their history of activism, I never heard about people like me. But I know I was there. And this brings me to the main thing I want to think about. Why is the history of British queer life, which is a history of activism, so whitewashed? And why is our migrant history so hetero-washed? I'm going to point to people like Sunil here, who hopefully can tell us later about some of the incredible activism that was taking place in the UK through the 80s and 90s. These were the people who laid the groundwork of queer South Asian identity in the UK. But what has stopped that history or the telling of that history? I think there's a couple of reasons. One is the divides within our community. So if I think about the kind of language I may have used in the 80s around certain kinds of anti-racist activism, I would have thought that I would have used the term British Asian, and I would know what it would have meant. And Black as a political identity was something that could be aligned to that. But after 9/11 and after the growth of and diversity of Britain's South Asian communities, you could see a fracturing along more specific community lines. So if there was a memory of collective anti-racist activism that was British Asian, it was beginning to segregate in unusual ways. And now, living in Scotland, I can tell you, looking around, people are not going to identify as British Asian, they're going to identify as Scottish Asian. Their allegiance to the British state has completely fractured. So in these increasingly devolving stories, what is the collective story that we have lost? And is it worth manufacturing one? Or actually, are some of those borders and divisions productive, and should they be maintained? I think there's a lack of remembering and connection between generations. I find it really striking when people tell me now who are younger than me about the absence of queer Asian representation, because on the one hand, I think if we look in the media, not that long ago, that was completely true, but that history is definitely there. The films were there, the publications were there, the people were there. So I can't help but think, what has been in place to make us forget them or to stand in the way of recognizing them in the way that other voices have been recognized? I think there's a lack of transnational connections in our history of activism or understanding of activism. I think especially now when we think of, say for example, the thing I know most about, queer South Asian activism in the UK, we don't necessarily think about the way that was connected through routes through Canada, Malaysia, Kenya, India, a global network that was that could connect around anti-colonial or like fighting against the legacy of colonialism in the present day, a conversation across geographical boundaries that kind of questions our traditional ideas about the state and those traditional ideas about the way history is told to us through the nation. And then the final point I would make is our lack of knowledge, which is a failure in teaching about our history of South Asian queer paths. I think it's somehow shameful that I have 3 degrees in English literature, but it was only in my 30s that I read Ismet Chugdai's The Quilt, the 1942 short story, which is explicitly lesbian. And I think about all of the things in the educational institutions around me which have transmitted to me the idea that South Asian lives are homophobic lives through their history and their mere existence. And that has been part of a project which we see in the colonial period that did everything from criminalizing Hijra communities in the 1870s through the Criminal Tribes Act to Penal Code 377, systematically making life impossible for South Asian queers. And that's a legacy that we live with. And I think that's why having a connected, historicized approach to intersectional queer history for us is so important today. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Rohit.
Thanks a lot for that, Chanjit. Lots and lots of very important points you've raised, which we will definitely discuss in the end. So I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Kumud Rana. Kumud has a PhD in sociology from the University of Glasgow. Her doctoral study is titled Transnational Resources and LGBTI Activism in Nepal. It focuses on the interactions between transnational activist networks and development donors that have helped shape LGBTI organizing in the country. Kumud's interests also include critical development studies, feminist and queer studies, sexuality and globalization. So over to you, Kumud. You've got 6 minutes.
Thanks, Rohit. I'll just pull down my screen. Yep. I have to start by saying that my research does not focus on queer migrants or queers in the diaspora. So for today's talk, I take an expansive understanding of migration to touch upon some of the important themes that have emerged from my research. And I would urge the audience to keep in mind two kinds of migration. The first is the migration or flow of ideas or discourses around LGBT rights and what it means to be a queer person in Nepal today. And by this, I don't just mean how categories like LGBT have migrated from the West, but also how similar exchanges have taken place in the South Asian context through regional and transnational networks. And secondly, I take into account the transnational circuits of migration of certain queer bodies. By this, I mean to present an account of what these transnational circuits are, who has access to them, and what this has meant for local social movements in places like Nepal. So in 2017, I came to know of a gay asylum seeker from Nepal whose application had been rejected by the UK Home Office on the grounds that homosexuality isn't illegal in the country, and that the legal victories gained by a third gender movement in Nepal meant that this person had no grounds on which to seek asylum. And both of these points were true. Homosexuality has never been a crime in the country, and that the Nepali Supreme Court had legally recognized a third gender category in 2007. So I was in the middle of my PhD study at this time, which was aimed at understanding precisely why the third gender movement was so successful, especially when homosexuality was not even recognized by the state until this 2007 judgment. In fact, the petitioners in 2007 had to categorically prove that LGBT people existed in Nepal, that homosexuality was not a disease or a Western import, and that the Nepali state needed to recognize them as a minority group, entitled to the protection of the state and the rights accrued to citizens by the state. The petition was led by an NGO, the Blue Diamond Society, that started out as a sexual health organization during the AIDS pandemic in South Asia in the 1990s for those categorized as men who have sex with men. And the organization itself was established in the year 2000. The NGO had been forced to register as a sexual health organization because local government officials refused to register a gay rights organization. And since then, HIV/AIDS networks have provided valuable resources for the LGBT movement in the country. And these include financial resources, technical expertise, professional networks. And in my study, I trace how these networks are linked to the gay rights activists in India and in the UK, and to the UK government's Department of International Development. HIV/AIDS networks have also provided access to resources for LGBT rights activism in Nepal, and often resources that go to the same organizations already working on HIV/AIDS. So this has meant that the movement, as led by the Blue Diamond Society, has been able to mobilize mainly those assigned male at birth, even while it has been able to bring together some of the most marginalized queer people on the basis of caste, class, and gender identity. The movement itself gives a lot of space to queer people coming from indigenous or ethnic minority groups in the country. Then in December of last year, that is in 2020, we had the first Nepali queer memoir, and it was titled Between Queens and the Cities. The author of the memoir, Niranjan Kumar, comes from a privileged background in terms of his class and caste positions, which he also acknowledges in the book. So he talks about being caught between Queens in New York, where he had emigrated for higher studies, and the twin cities of Kathmandu and Lalitpur in Nepal, where he's now based. So the memoir juxtaposes the silence of the closet that Kumar grew up in the 1990s in Nepal, with the pulsing music of gay and diasporic South Asian clubs in New York, where he felt like he was free to do as he pleased. But whenever he returned to Nepal for visits, Kumar repeatedly encountered the silence, hurt, and subsequent rage he had grown up with within his family. And throughout the book, we see how that rage and isolation spills onto his familial and romantic relationships. Kumar wants to stay on in the US because he doesn't see a life for himself in Nepal, where he has been bullied and been subject to mental and sometimes physical violence, both within the family and in the boys' school where he was sent as a young child. At one point, his father asks him if he can live his life on his own so that the family doesn't have to go through this shame of having a gay son. And if he were to return to Nepal, he was told it would be best for him to fold back into the silence again. But of course, Kumar doesn't remain silent. He goes on to write about life as a gay man in Nepal, first under a pseudonym and later under his own name. And the book is under his own name as well. So we see this contradiction in Nepal, where there's a seemingly successful LGBT movement, where legal recognition is granted to transgender people. There's the inclusion of a third gender category in the national census and in the passport and in citizenship certificates. And these are important milestones for the movement, no doubt. But we also see this other side where queer people must migrate to live the life they want to live and feel like they must stay away in order to live this life. And sometimes the only way they can find acceptance is by reinforcing this linear idea of progress, that is, by moving from a traditional or what is seen as a backward society to one which is seemingly progressive and modern, and by carrying that modern subjectivity along with them as they move back into the country. But then this is not the full story of activism within Nepal, as we know, as I briefly mentioned with regards to the third gender movement. And maybe I could answer questions later on if you'd like to know more about that as well.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that, Kumud. I think there's quite a lot of questions that you've raised as well in your presentation. So thanks for that. I'm going to move on now to our third speaker. So our third speaker is Luca Chul, who is a lecturer in digital media and society in the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. Amongst other things, Lukács has recently published the report Queer Polls in UK, Identity, Migration and Social Media. And Lukács is also the author of the book Transnational Homosexuals in Communist Poland, Cross-Border Flows in Gay and Lesbian Magazines. So over to you, Lukács.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I have one slide that I tried to share, but now it says that host disabled participants screen sharing, but it's not a big deal because it was not that important. I just want to tell you something about my recent project, the one that just Rohit mentioned about queer polls in the UK. So I conducted about 800 survey, and I got about 800 online survey responses, and I conducted 30 face-to-face interviews with Polish LGBTQs in the UK. I'm just getting information. I can share it now, and indeed it works right now. So that's the only slide that I prepared. It's about the report, yeah, so you can have some information about the report, and you can see also the link to the report if you would like to access it. And so I would like to, so in that research project, I focused on my participants' discussions of the understanding of their identities, migration experience, as well as the uses of social media and dating apps. And now I would like to kind of tell you a little bit about that project, focusing specifically on the concept of intersectionality, which is also in the title of this panel. So the concept of intersectionality, I think, is super popular now in activism and research circles. And for me, it also is very important and inspirational in my work. It, of course, was coined by the Kimberly Crenshaw, but particularly I was inspired how Jasbir Puar was rethinking that concept with the theories, with the postmodern theories, and particularly with the concept of assemblage. So Jasbir Puar was encouraging us to think about intersectionality or different intersections or different aspects of our identities, not as a gridlock model that we just were born at the intersection of different aspects of our identities, and it stays like that, it's fixed, but rather to think about it as an assemblage, that it's not fixed, that it's flexible, that a particular situation, particular context, different aspects of our identities, like gender, sexuality, ethnicity, race, class, nationality, intersect in a very particular way. Some of the intersections matter more than others, and then it's becoming disassembled and reassembled, maybe a little bit differently in different situations and different contexts. And I think that's a very useful way, at least for me in my work, to think about what kind of intersections matter and when do they matter. But also it's a little bit challenging because it challenges us to think about what kind of intersection shall we focus on in our research and in our activism. And you could see that in my project, by design, I kind of assumed that some kind of intersection matters. I assumed that national identity matter, being Poles, that migration status matter, being Poles in UK, and also I assumed that those two aspects of identities intersect also with LGBTQ identities, hence queer Poles in UK. But that was just my assumption. It's when I actually started conducting this research project, I realized that those intersections are important to different people to different extents. And also that some other aspects of their identities becoming maybe important or silent in different particular situations. So I will give you some examples here. So one of my participants was a gay man in Nottingham, and he was, his main problem was that he was not speaking English very well at the moment of our interviews. So because of that, he very much relied on the Polish migrant networks in the UK for support. So when he was looking for a new place to rent, for example, he went to a Polish migrant network on Facebook or Facebook fan page, and then he was posting information there that he was looking for a new room to rent. But then he also noted that he is gay. So the intersections, again, of being Polish and gay, but also not being able to speak English fluently in the UK was important for him at that moment. He posted that because he didn't want to end up with some homophobic people and sharing a flat with them. But then, of course, not of course, but then he got a lot of hateful comments there, as quite a lot of Polish communities in the UK could be heteronormative. So for him, I think it was this kind of intersections and language skills were particularly important. For another of my participants, a lesbian woman in Brighton, the issue of money, so other aspect of class, we can probably think about it as that, was very important. As she had a job in Brighton and she wanted to apply for a British citizenship, and she formally was had a right to apply for that, but she just didn't have money for that. And she wanted to apply for that because at the time of our interviews, that was also the time right after the Brexit referendum, and she felt a lot of anxieties about her status as a Polish person in the UK. So for her, the issue of money also became important in all those stories that we discussed in our interviews. And finally, I want to mention a story of a trans woman that was living at that time in Basildon. And at that time, before Brexit happened, it was actually not that important to have a British ID if you were a Polish person in the UK. Polish documents were widely recognized here and still are to some extent. But then for her, she wanted to change her legal gender on her identification documents. And that meant that she had to deal with the Polish authorities back in Poland rather than those in the UK. So again, those aspects were especially important for her at that particular moment of her life. So I will finish here, but I think I would like to provoke kind of questions and reflections about what kind of intersections we focus on in our research and also in our activism, especially when very often we have to kind of pre-design that. Like in a lot of grant applications in research, we are asked to know what we research before we actually start doing research, while we don't know which actually intersections matter really for particular people in particular contexts and situations. So I will stop it here, and maybe I'll be very happy to continue that in the questions and answers session.
Fabulous. Thanks a lot for that, Lukasz. Really, really exciting work. So we're going to now move on to our next panelist, which is Sunil Gupta. Sunil has been involved with independent photography and critical practice for many years, focusing on race, migration, and queer issues. In the 1980s, Gupta constructed documentary images of gay men in architectural spaces in Delhi, which was his Exiles series. His early documentary series, Christopher Street, was shot in the mid-1970s as he studied under Lisette Model at the New School for Social Research in New York. Gupta's published works include monographs such as Queer, Wish You Were Here, Memories of a Gay Life, Pictures from Here. He has more recently exhibited Dissent and Desire at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. And his forthcoming publications are Lovers 10 Years On and Sunil Gupta From Here to Eternity 2020. There's also a long list of all the places that he's exhibited in, which I'm not going to go into, but I will hand over straight to you, Sunil. Sunil, you need to unmute yourself. Okay.
Okay. All right. So, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Rohit. I'm going to try and be as concise as possible. I've realized that I've just been around for way too long, but I've noted that there's several interesting points already. I'll try and weave them into my brief discussion, starting with Chiranjeev's idea that things are kind of more flexible and identities are very flexible. And I'm going to suggest that maybe that's not a bad thing given the history that we've come from. And I'm just going to go over the history in my brief presentation. So my activism is really around culture and visual culture, photography mainly. And I was coming out of college, emerging from an MA in London in the early 80s. And so I was looking at gay life, and I was using Gay Switchboard, for example, as a project idea to study them, study London through them. At the same time, I was very interested in documenting social change in India. And my big plan was really to be a social justice kind of photographer, focusing on the South, focusing on India largely. And then when I was shooting in India, I thought I'm going to look at what it's like for gay men. This is now 1980, 81. And I discovered that there was lots of gay sex, obviously, but nobody was willing to be photographed about it. And nobody would speak about it in polite society. So I tried to make some pictures because, you know, that's always what I want to do. And that was almost impossible. So I made this one picture, showed it to the Guardian, and then it got published. And I wrote a little piece about it, about how nobody wanted to really discuss it. And before I forget, I did my PhD, it's called Queer Migration, and my great discovery doing that retrospective analysis, I just did my PhD recently at Westminster, was that I'd always thought of my migration as looking back at India, like always, like in India prefaces everything. But in fact, my migration turned out to be more about the arrival, because by arriving in Canada, 1 month after Stonewall, I found there a gay identity, which was much more meaningful for me at that time when I was 17 than being of Indian origin. Being of Indian origin, where I was in my high school, was completely meaningless. Nobody had even heard of India, to be honest. And actually the gay thing really saved my bacon. And so I really took to it in the early forms of gay liberation front kind of ideas. And that's kind of what has carried me through. And then India kind of got added on in the 80s here. So there's exiles, as was mentioned. So finally, in the mid 80s, I got a chance to go back and reconsider it properly. And I made this more constructed bunch of pictures. I realized my training had taught me how to make documentary pictures of Indian gay men having sex in the parks, but that wouldn't have been very ethical, shall we say. So I came up with this other idea to do this reconstructed documentary work. And then mid 80s for me, based in London, was the Black Arts moment. And I became very Black identified. In fact, when I left the RCA in 83, we had the first Black student show. And for me, it was very much about being a post-colonial moment. It wasn't about your skin color. In the first exhibitions, it started with the Irish and extended outwards to everybody who'd ever been a subject of of England's colonies, actually England in particular, England's colonies. And so there was a photographic exhibition I was part of that called Reflections of the Black Experience in Brixton. I made a bunch of pictures about Asian life at the time, activism, family life, gay life. This was one of my problems in the 80s was in terms of visual culture was that South Asians in London were very shy and were not willing to be exposed through photography. So I was finding it really difficult to find subjects, willing subjects. And although groups like Shakti had started, and I was part of something briefly, I used to go to meetings of the gay Black group in Marshman Street at Gay's the Word, where I met some people, and then we migrated to the Shakti in up in Caledonian Road. But I think people were just not ready to be photographed. So hence I used to use myself. And then a bunch of us from that exhibition met for a few years and we formed this organization Autograph, which was really a lobbying outfit for photographers of African, Caribbean and South Asian descent. I'm very proud that it's still around and that it's still a coalition around Black African, Black Caribbean and South Asian. There are very few joint NGOs or if you like activist groups that have survived for so long. And then the 80s, I'm sorry, I'm a bit stuck in the 80s, a lot happened. There was Clause 28 happened. I took pictures and then I made a body of work about it. In fact, while I'm showing you this picture, it's part of my, it's not really a portrait of the people, but I'll just mention that person in that picture on the left is Shivananda Khan, who I met at Shakti, and he invited me to join him to run it, but I said, no, I didn't want to run anything. So he kind of ran it and I just came along to give some moral support. Shivananda, of course, went on to India to work with NAS and set up NAS in Delhi and Delhi Lucknow. But I did make a number of shows that were pursuing my interests, either gay or South Asian. This was a photographic show that we had in London. And also at the same time, there was
2 minutes for you to wrap up.
Okay, so I'll just stick with the 80. I think otherwise it's going to be overrunning. So AIDS happened also. So you can imagine the 80s was like this huge moment. So if you were South Asian and gay, there was fear from all sides. I found the UK very oppressive after New York. I'd come here from North America. which was much more open, as we saw in Christopher Street. The UK, although had legalized gay sex, had this very oppressive persecution of gay men in the media, but also actual persecution. I think this country holds a record of arrests of gay men, something like 68,000 plus, which I saw in The Guardian the other day. That's a lot of actual arrests of people. So they would, so cruising was illegal, basically. If you said hello to some stranger on the street, they could arrest you. So then our response was to make an AIDS exhibition, or about AIDS, a photographic one. This opened in 1990, and I thought I missed this one earlier slide. 86 was an interesting year. I was involved with an outfit called Camera Work in the East End, which was a gallery and a magazine on Roman Road. And the same year, we had Darshan, which was the South Asian photo exhibition. And then also Same Difference, which was an LGBTQ photo exhibition. And so some of us in the Darshan exhibition were very out queers. There was myself, there was Mumtaz Karimji, and similarly in Same Difference, there were a couple of us who were very actively organizing around Black photography, myself, and there's Rotimi Fani Kayode, who's sitting in the middle of that picture, who became Autograph's first chairperson. And basically then through my artwork, I was able to then travel and make more shows and then go to more international settings. This is Havana Biennial, which is very focused on the South, to meet other contemporary artists, my age group, who are working in, my peers in Latin America, in Africa, and in other parts of Asia. So that was very exciting. So I feel living here that if you just think about us South Asians here, it can seem like a very small, little bit isolated and inward looking, so I found it very useful strategy to try and make these larger connections with similar folk elsewhere, either who are also fighting similar battles around intersectionality, about decentering and decolonizing history and decolonizing academia. And I think I'm running out of time now, so I shall stop there and say that my activism has been culture focused.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that, Sunil.
Okay, I'll stop screen sharing also. Yeah, there you go.
I think that was a lot of food for thought and some really, really exciting imagery over there. But we can, I'm hoping, some of those will come up in the Q&A. So thanks a lot for that. And finally, gives me great pleasure to introduce our final panelist, which is Raisa Kabir. Raisa Kabir lives and works in London. Kabir is an interdisciplinary artist and weaver who utilizes woven text, textile, sound, video, and performance to translate and visualize concepts concerning the cultural politics of cloth, labor, and embodied geographies. Kabir has participated in residencies and exhibited work internationally. I'm just going to read some of them because there is a lot. She is very, very well represented. So the Whitworth, the Tetley, Raven Row, Cove Park, Textile Arts Center in New York City, and the Center for Craft, Creativity, and Design. Kabir has also lectured on her research at the Tate Modern, ICA, London College of Fashion, the Coutol, Royal College of Art, and others. And then there's also a list of all the other exhibitions that she's done. But I'm just going to mention one because this is how I was introduced to Raisa's work, which was her exhibition at Rich Mix, which was about queer South Asians, and also very, very, I think, I can't find the name now, Raisa, but I'm sure you're going to talk about, it's called Invisible Space, Queer Dimensionality, Space and Affect. So over to you, Raisa.
Thanks, Rohit. Oh yeah, it's embarrassing about the bio. I don't know where that's from. Yeah, no, the piece is called Invisible Spaces, and I haven't actually included that because we're going to do 5 slides. So yeah, my background has been to work with with photography and look at South Asian queer cultural dress. And I think this is where this few slides lead on from, about the connection perhaps between migration and textiles, particularly between two areas such as Punjab and Kashmir, the border region, and Bengal and Cllr, and how these places were impacted by partition in 1947, and how this and also this fueled and functioned as a catalyst for migration to the UK, and many people settled in the north and ended up working in the textile industry. So I've just got a slide here that show an archive from 1860 that catalogues some textiles from those regions, from Dhaka and Bengal and Kashmir. Yeah, and so this is a map work that I have. It looks at the I've forgotten the word, but the validity of these borders that were, you know, our colonial and violent borders, and the creation of a nation state. And the way I use textiles in my work, I try and use these histories, and perhaps apply a queer methodology or a queer way of thinking around the idea of borders, around the idea of structures, and how weaving, I'm a weaver, I use textiles, how that can bend the structures or resist the structures that we have involving borders and subsequent South Asian migration. So I'm just showing you some images of textiles from that region and a map from that region, so you can see those borders as they are inscribed into maps, geographical maps. So this is a work of mine. It's called "It Must Be Nice to Fall in Love," and it's hand woven by me. And I propose that this textile uses a queer entanglement by using the lines of the borders of partition have been woven not as a line or a fixed line, but as a tangle. And the tangle complicates the idea of the border, and it draws us to contest the idea that borders are fixed and permanent and final, but actually that they are permeable and they distort, and that they can be contested. And so these borders woven in my works draw the messiness of that huge partition migration between the borders of that land, but also the global migration of people were displaced from their land and became diasporas in the UK, Canada, US, and took their textiles with them, and took that archival, the archives of what textiles represent with them. My work's very anti-nationalist, so I've got a little piece here that again is, I'm trying to evoke textiles as languages and how textiles can perform text. So this is a woven piece that has coded a Bengali language, Bengali script, and it is a line which says Amar Desh. So you can read that there. Amar Desh, my country, my home, my land, my diaspora, my motherland is a memory of unwoven dreams. I feel when we are situated in the diaspora, we tend to romanticize and long for a land or a place that doesn't exist anymore, and fetishize the idea of nationhood, and be that India or Bangladesh. These nation states are currently in occupations, and there's border violence in Kashmir, in Cllr, in Darjeeling, in Burma, Myanmar, where these borders were created after 1947 in post-war, post-colonial time. And yeah, so a performance of mine, which I think is about placing my queer body, disabled body, with the machines of textile production and the histories that these textile industries and legacies of South Asian textile heritages, but also its deep ingrained link to exploitation by empire and by colonization, and the link between the craft maker and the craft laborer and people of color, and how this work takes place within a gallery and reanimates the archive and reanimates these issues of migration and diaspora and enforced displacement. So this is me doing a dance and a performance with a loom weaving. And yeah, I just wanted to end with a textile that kind of draws elements from all these threads of text languages, the queer entanglement, building new languages or structures, and how textiles and South Asian identity can be intermingled. And this piece is from a poem that I wrote about being South Asian and queer, and how being like a beautiful woven textile, the surface, at the surface, people would just read that this is just a piece of woven cloth, and that it doesn't contain the violent histories or the voices and the hidden voices that might not be legible because they don't know how to read the text. And so the text is in Bengali. It's called Lift the Veil and See Our Silent Language, and is about the kind of invisibleness of the intersections of being South Asian, queer, femme, disabled, and how those different layers of identity can be misread or misunderstood or down out erased or not believed. And this kind of comes together in the formation of this textile, which I will end there, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raisa, for those beautiful work. I mean, you know, again, so much to unpack over there. And I think, you know, just kind of thinking about the panel as a whole, I think, you know, between all the different presentations and all the issues that we've discussed, there's just all of these fantastic connections. So I've got a couple of questions for all of you, but I want to start off with questions from the audience. And actually the first question that we've got kind of, you know, goes across all of your presentations. And then audience members, if you want to ask more questions, please do. So the question is, I'm interested in this interaction between local national struggles for LGBTQ rights and the global local LGBTQ movement. Do panelists think that the global LGBTIQ movement is still important? Historically, it provided symbolic and material support, but I wonder if this is still the case, especially in the context of decolonization. So, Raisa, I obviously want to give you a moment to breathe. So I will rather maybe go on to the first speaker. Chunji, do you want to come in on this question?
Really broad point, isn't it? Because like there have been quite a lot of people that have said that the language around LGBTQI rights is not appropriate to label and tag people, and especially with its connection or like criminalization of homosexuality in like British colonial like legal rulings and discourse, that we should actually be rejecting that and rewriting it. I mean, you can even just probably tell by the tone of my voice, like, yeah, I totally understand those arguments, but I also fundamentally believe in a conception of humanity and human rights which has zero regard for borders. And when our lives as the descendants of migrants or living lives that have influences from so many places in the world. I don't understand how you can begin to partition language about human rights, which are sexual rights. Just don't.
Absolutely. Thanks, Junjit. Lukács, I know you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we should probably think what is actually global LGBTQ activism, what do we actually mean by that? And I think I would prefer to think about kind of transnational connections, that they are those transnational connections and they still do matter, rather than just like one global LGBTQ movement. But there are still some differences, especially also what we are fighting against. And just to give one example, I think here in the UK, but also in some other Western countries, one key issue recently emerging in the movement is the discourse of the so-called gender critical discourse, So by excluding trans people and trans people rights. In Poland, this discourse is not very prominent. Yet we have a different kind of discourse. We have a discourse of the so-called gender ideology, which is also transnational discourse, but it's not as prominent, for example, in some Western countries. And both of those kind of discourses share something. They share this kind of, they both kind of cling to the idea of the primacy of biological sex understood in a very narrow way, but still they're coming from many different circles. And there are some key differences there. So I would rather prefer to think about it as kind of many different transnational connections and many different levels. Sometimes are very useful to make those connections, and sometimes maybe a little bit less useful.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone else want to come in on this question? Okay, yeah, I see Kumud and Sunil. First Kumud, then I'll go to Sunil. Kumud.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo what Lukács said about global. I'm quite critical of what is conceptualized as global versus what is conceptualized as local, and I prefer to call the movement transnational because that takes into account national, regional, various levels of connections, various types of connections as well. But then I would say transnational connections are important because without that, the movement wouldn't have existed in Nepal, in many other Asian countries as well, and South Asian countries as well. But also that we do need to be careful about how that is playing out in different contexts, especially when that is tied to development aid, when that is tied to what kinds of identities are legible or translatable to the English language, and then what then gets ignored. Especially subjectivities that are talked about in local terms. In local, by local, I mean in the various Nepali languages, for instance. But also how what Rahul Rao talks about, another queer scholar talks about in terms of homo capitalism, how the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund use this idea of homo nationalism, the Western countries promoting or being more friendly to homosexuality, and how that then creates certain kinds of aid conditionalities for people who are dependent on that kind of aid, and then they have to then be more legible for these kinds of donors, and how that creates hierarchies within movements as well. Yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
And actually, Kumud, on the basis of that, I actually did have a question for you, especially about the Blue Diamond Society, and kind of, as you said, a lot of this kind of is so directed by funders, and I think you've kind of already touched a bit on that, but maybe you can talk about that a bit later. Let me move on to Sunil, and then I'll come back. So Sunil, you wanted to respond to this as well? You need to unmute.
Yeah, I did. And actually, I'm just going to very quickly also add a little comment to what Kumud and you were just discussing about in terms of India and the way AIDS funding has set an agenda. Because India had the opposite experience of the UK. AIDS was not a gay plague, it was a straight plague, but AIDS funding created a discussion around gay sexuality, created spaces for it to take place. And what was disappointing is that definitions then flowed from Geneva into the recipient countries, say, like India, for example. So they suddenly, people have become MSM. Who the hell, what's MSM? You know, that's a UN invented category. It's not a person. And then now you go to Delhi, people say, hum to MSM hai ji. I'm thinking, how are you saying that? That doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, other kinds of AIDS NGOs invented or kind of coaxed together an indigenous kind of category to counter the gay identity, a kind of Kothi identity, right? Which was meant to be this somewhat oppositional, but a class-based one, which was completely dependent on these very same UN-funded agencies or Elton John kind of agencies. You know what I mean? So they had no power. Nobody asked them what they thought, but they were defined by some other people and were forced to kind of live up to this definition in order to get the money, in order to get the medication. You then have to enact the Kothi to get the money. You know, it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm in a rage about that, but I'm going to stop. That's not what I really wanted to say. What I wanted to say was, okay, so we've had some definitions ideologically coming from the West, you know, lesbian, gay, all that. But I think nowadays, look what's happened with the pandemic. We're all working on Zoom, and the transnational is no longer an issue. Everybody's discussing all over the globe, can meet and discuss like this. So what I find is that South Asia, India definitely missed LGBT, missed gay liberation, but they got queer. So I was living in Delhi, and suddenly everybody became queer. Everybody who came out of higher education. So queer is a theoretical idea that came from Yale and spread globally to universities. And there's South Asian study departments, there's sexuality, gender, feminist departments, and queer is being discussed, I think, not only in this part of the world, but definitely in South Asian departments. And throughout this year, one has been able to join in as a listener to Zoom discussions that are based in Indian universities, who are able to have Judith Butler is on the panel. So-and-so from Yale is on the panel, but the focal point, you know, the place where it's happening is Calcutta or Delhi or Bombay or Bangalore. You know what I mean? So that transnational discussion of what is queer, I think that is now being picked up and people have run with it. It's no longer just this Western idea. And I think our technology has facilitated that. You know, gone is the expense of flying you over or us flying over. You know, now people don't have to leave South Asia to go to New York to be part of it. They can bring them there, they can stay where they are and the discussion comes to them. So that's, okay, I'll stop there. I've said my 2 bits. So.
No, thanks, Sunil. I think that there's lots of really, really important stuff. And I was kind of thinking about queer as a term and the way in India it's been transliterated into all the different various languages.
Everybody's queer.
Necessarily the kind of the conceptual understanding of what it is, or kind of, you know, almost kind of, you know, taking away the queerness from queer. I was thinking of Jasbir's new book, actually, Left of Queer, and you know, they kind of talk about the radicalism of queer, but I'm not the one talking, so I want all of you to talk, and I know we are going out of time. However, Raisa Kabir, I just wanted to come to you because I was left very speechless by you know, the stuff that you just showed, and I'm really, really interested to hear more about the idea of queer entanglement. I loved you know, you spoke about messiness, you spoke about unruliness. You know, Gayatri Gopinath's new book is called Unruly, and I'm just thinking, you know, that's what queer is about. That's what queer politics is about. How are you working through these issues? Because I love it. And just on the basis of that, I think you've also, you know, you mentioned about the history of government and labor. And, you know, I was watching Chomtuli Huck's film, Shromik Awaj, Worker's Voice, you know, which talks about this and about the kind of the exploitation. So I love the way you've managed to bring in those intersectional identities. So I just wanted to talk a bit about the queer entanglements. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rohit. Yeah, I didn't want to complicate it too much because I know that there's so many themes in my work, but the central thing for me when I'm weaving is I see weaving as a fundamental structure for for human existence. It's like the first type of architecture was woven, and the fact that they're all perpendicular lines, it's all very straight, lots of very, very straight lines. And this is kind of like a symbolism for a heterosexual colonial way of a structure of a society, these perpendicular lines and these lots and lots of straight lines all making surfaces. And this way to use weaving and to kind of embody these histories, I think, was to rupture the cloth. And the idea of the tangle, it's like we don't have to, the running mill of production of capitalism, which, you know, includes disabled bodies, post-colonial bodies, this idea of the transnational, you were saying about the global, the fact that everything is imported, everything is moving across the world, and we've seen the havoc that's played, and we remove the idea of labor from the actual laborer, from the body. We don't visualize the body. And for me, weaving these performances places the body back in the messiness and back with the site of making. And so, yeah, I call it my unweaving method, and it's the cloth kind of erupts. And what you have to remember about yarn is before it's been woven, before it's become a cloth, become a garment, that thread, just a thread on its own, that farmer has grown it, cultivated it, processed it, reared the animal or processed the plant, bleached it, washed it, carded it, spun it, and then it's the yarn, and then it's been wound on, all of that labor just in the thread. And so I guess my queer entanglement is the tangling of the threads is the weaving. It's a refusal. It's a politics of refusal to be a functional, sellable, collectible fabric. It cannot be contained, and it celebrates the messiness and the tanglement and the beauty of all the embodied labor in the thread itself, without having to adhere to the structures we have in society.
Thanks a lot, Rai. I mean, I think that's a really good way for us to end, you know, the politics of refusal. You're taking queer back to kind of, you know, the radical potentials of being able to refuse, of being able to say no, and kind of all the messiness and unruliness that goes with it. I think, you know, I just want to thank all of you. You know, you've all been absolutely fantastic. You know, I've admired all of your work. So for me to put you all together and have this conversation today has been extremely amazing for me. And for me, the main thing was actually to make sure this conversation wasn't happening within kind of the academic spaces, the artist spaces that all of us inhabit, but actually having it in this space of the local authority. And I wish, you know, if we were not in lockdown, you know, I could have had you all in the town hall in discussion. But I'm just really, really grateful to all of you for attending this and for being panelists. I want to also thank Dominic and Monica for all your hard work behind the scenes. You know, it couldn't have been done without you. And finally, I want to thank all our attendees who've come today, who've asked questions, and who've been here to support us. So thank you all. And finally, we do have a few other events, and we have the cabaret. So if you want to know more about it, you can go to newhamlgbthistory.org, and you will have all the details there. So all it remains for me is to say thank you to all of you.
Thanks, Rohit.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
coming and listening.
Thanks.
Thank you.